It was supposed to be just another press conference, another routine interaction between the President of the United States and the press corps. But for Donald Trump, it was never just routine. Every press briefing was a battle, a war of words, a test of strength against a media that he believed had long abandoned objectivity in favor of a political agenda. He had come prepared, ready to deliver his message directly to the American people, unfiltered, undistorted. However, what was about to unfold would become one of the most talked about confrontations in press conference history. As Trump took his place before the cameras, a familiar tension filled the room. The press corps, armed with their notebooks, recorders, and cameras, had their questions prepared, their narratives already forming. Among them was a CNN reporter, notorious for his aggressive questioning, a journalist who had built a reputation for pushing boundaries, often crossing the fine line between professional inquiry and open confrontation. It didn't take long for the atmosphere to shift. The reporter, wasting no time, seized the moment to launch a series of pointed questions, each laced with insinuations, each crafted to provoke a reaction. He framed his words carefully, not merely seeking information, but baiting the president into a response that could be twisted and dissected for headlines. Trump listened, his expression unreadable at first. He had seen this tactic before: the interruptions, the refusal to accept an answer, the persistence that went beyond journalistic curiosity and into the realm of political theater. He let the reporter speak, but as the interruptions continued, his patience began to wear thin. He had given his answer, yet the journalist refused to yield, pressing on, speaking over him, disregarding the decorum expected in such a setting. Then, with his characteristic directness, Trump responded. His voice, steady but firm, cut through the noise. He had tolerated enough. He called the journalist out for what he was: a rude, terrible person. The words landed like a shockwave in the room. The press corps, accustomed to politicians carefully maneuvering their way through confrontations, were taken aback. There was no hesitation in Trump's tone, no attempt to soften the blow. But he didn't stop there. He knew this moment was bigger than a single exchange. It was about something deeper, a fight for fairness, for truth, for the right to speak without being drowned out by those who had long positioned themselves as the gatekeepers of public opinion. He turned his words into an indictment of an entire industry, one he believed had strayed from its duty to inform and had instead chosen to manipulate. He declared with unwavering conviction that certain members of the press were no longer serving the people, but rather their own interests. He accused them of deception, of crafting narratives rather than reporting facts. And then he delivered the statement that would echo beyond that room, beyond that day. He labeled them the enemy of the people. Gasps filled the space. The reaction was immediate. Some reporters looked at each other, stunned. Others furiously scribbled down notes, already shaping their headlines. But Trump did not falter. He knew the weight of his words, and he stood by them. In that moment, he had done something few leaders dared to do. He had spoken the truth as he saw it, without fear of backlash, without the need for approval. It was not just a personal defense against a hostile journalist. It was a statement of defiance against a media establishment that he believed had long abandoned the principles of fairness. As the confrontation unfolded, cameras rolled, capturing every word, every gesture. Within minutes, the exchange would be broadcast to millions, analyzed, dissected, debated. Critics would condemn him, allies would rally behind him. But one thing was certain: this was no ordinary press conference. This was a defining moment, a clash between a president who refused to be silenced and a media machine determined to control the narrative. The battle lines had been drawn, and Donald Trump, as always, was standing his ground. If you believe in leadership, power, and second chances, this is the place for you. Hit that like button, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to never miss an inspiring Trump story. Donald Trump had never been a man to mince words. He had built his career, his empire, and his presidency on the foundation of directness, on a refusal to be controlled by the norms of political correctness or the expectations of the elite. He spoke the way he always had, boldly, unapologetically, and without hesitation. And in this moment, as the tension in the room thickened, he knew he would not back down. As the CNN reporter continued to push, Trump's patience wore thin. He had answered the question, yet the journalist persisted, not in search of truth, but in an attempt to create a spectacle. The interruptions, the raised voice, the relentless insistence, it was all a performance, a deliberate strategy to provoke a reaction. And Trump saw through it. Then, with the same force that had propelled him through decades of business and political battles, he fired back. His voice, steady and unwavering, echoed across the room as he called the reporter out for what he was, a rude, terrible person. The moment hit like a thunderclap. The chatter that had filled the room just seconds before vanished. The air itself seemed to tighten. The other journalists, many of whom had come prepared with their own pointed questions, exchanged glances. Some looked shocked, others scribbled furiously in their notebooks, already shaping the headlines that would dominate the news cycle. Trump did not stop. He knew this was bigger than a single moment, bigger than just one reporter. His words carried weight, aimed not only at the man standing before him, but at an entire institution that he believed had abandoned its responsibility to the people. With the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime cutting through deception, he exposed what he saw as the real issue, a media machine that no longer reported facts, but shaped narratives to fit its own agenda. He pointed at the reporter, his tone unwavering. You are part of the problem. You and your network distort the truth. You don't report the news, you manufacture it. The words struck deep. They weren't just an attack on a single journalist. They were an indictment of an entire industry. Trump knew exactly what he was doing. He had spent years battling the press, watching as they twisted his words, took statements out of context, and manipulated headlines to serve their own purposes. He had seen how they worked, how they picked their targets, how they selectively edited reality to fit a larger narrative. And now, standing before them, he refused to let it go unchallenged. Reactions erupted across the room. Some reporters murmured in disbelief. Others, emboldened by their colleagues' confrontation, began crafting their own rebuttals. But there were also those who sat in quiet recognition. Journalists who, though they would never admit it publicly, knew that Trump had a point. The media had changed, objectivity had eroded, the role of the press had shifted from neutral observer to active participant, shaping public perception rather than simply informing it. Outside the walls of the press briefing, the impact of Trump's words spread like wildfire. News channels interrupted their scheduled programming, social media platforms exploded with reactions, and within minutes, millions of people were weighing in. Some denounced his comments, calling them an attack on the free press, a dangerous precedent for political discourse. Others saw something different. They saw a leader standing his ground, refusing to bow to an institution that had long wielded unchecked power over public opinion. Across the country, Trump's supporters rallied behind him. To them, this was not just a moment of defiance, it was a reckoning. They had watched for years as the media painted their leader as a villain, twisting his successes into failures, amplifying his mistakes while ignoring his victories. And now here he was, fighting back, refusing to let them dictate the narrative. Trump had never been afraid to confront power, and in that press conference, he had done exactly that. He had called out not just a reporter, but an entire system that had, in his eyes, abandoned truth for influence. It was not diplomacy. It was not calculated politeness. It was raw, unfiltered leadership. The press would spend days dissecting his words, analyzing their implications, debating whether he had crossed a line. But for those who had grown tired of media manipulation, of carefully curated stories designed to control public thought, it was a moment of clarity. Trump had done what few before him had dared to do. He had stood in the heart of the media machine, looked it in the eye, and told the world exactly what he saw. And whether loved or hated, agreed with or opposed, one thing was undeniable. His words had left an impact that could not be ignored. Donald Trump had always been a man of conviction, unafraid to challenge the status quo, unwilling to bow to forces that sought to control public perception. He had built his career, his empire, and his presidency on the idea that truth should not be dictated by those with an agenda. And now, in this defining moment, as the tension in the room reached its peak, he would say something that would be remembered for years to come. He had already called out the journalist for his lack of professionalism, already exposed the manipulation at play. But he knew that the problem was not just about one reporter. It was much bigger than that. It was systemic. It was about an entire institution that had, in his eyes, long abandoned its duty to inform and had instead taken on the role of shaping narratives, protecting elites, and misleading the American people. Then, with the weight of history behind him and the unwavering confidence of a man who had spent his life fighting battles others feared to face, he spoke. "You are the enemy of the people." The words cut through the air with the force of a thunderclap. The room froze. For a brief moment, even those who had come prepared to attack him were caught off guard. This was not just another exchange of political rhetoric. This was a declaration, a challenge, a statement that would echo far beyond those walls. Trump did not hesitate, did not backpedal. He stood firm, knowing exactly what he was saying and why he was saying it. He was calling out what he saw as a betrayal of the American people by those who were supposed to serve them with honesty and integrity. He was speaking directly to millions of Americans who had long felt unheard, misrepresented, and deceived by the very institutions that claimed to speak for them. The reactions were immediate. Some in the press pool erupted in protest, their faces a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Others scribbled furiously in their notebooks, knowing they had just witnessed a moment that would dominate headlines for days, weeks, maybe even years. Outside, the country was already reacting. Within minutes, television networks, online publications, and social media platforms exploded with commentary. Some pundits called it an unprecedented attack on democracy, a dangerous escalation in the war on the press. Others, however, saw it as a long-overdue reckoning, a fearless leader finally exposing the corruption and bias that had plagued mainstream journalism for decades. Donald Trump's journey is filled with resilience, bold decisions, and unforgettable moments. Stay inspired. Like this video, drop a comment below, and subscribe to be part of this movement. For Trump's supporters, this was not just another bold statement. It was a battle cry. To them, the press had long since abandoned objectivity, choosing instead to act as political operatives, twisting facts, omitting key details, and relentlessly attacking anyone who challenged their preferred narrative. They had watched as positive stories were buried, as misinformation was spread without accountability, and as their voices were drowned out by a media machine that seemed more interested in controlling public thought than reporting reality. To them, Trump's words were not an attack on journalism. They were a defense of truth. In the days that followed, the backlash was fierce. Media outlets condemned him, political opponents accused him of authoritarianism, and fact-checkers scrambled to dissect every syllable. Yet amidst the noise, something had changed. The phrase, "enemy of the people," had entered the political lexicon in a way that could not be ignored. It had become a symbol, a defining moment in the ongoing battle between a president who refused to be controlled and a press that had long wielded unchecked influence over public opinion. Even those who opposed him had to acknowledge the impact of his words. He had challenged an industry that had, for decades, gone unchallenged. He had forced a conversation that many had feared to have. And most importantly, he had done something few leaders dared to do. He had spoken not for the powerful, not for the elite, but for the people who had been silenced. His presidency was filled with defining moments, but this one stood among the most significant, because in that instant, Trump had drawn a line in the sand, not just for himself, but for an entire nation that was waking up to the reality of media manipulation. Love him or hate him, agree or disagree, one thing was certain. Donald Trump had changed the game forever, and the battle for truth would never be the same again. Donald Trump had ignited a firestorm. The moment his words left his lips, the impact rippled across the nation, shaking the very foundation of the media establishment. Newsrooms buzzed with urgency as producers scrambled to shift their coverage, anchoring their broadcasts around the controversial statement. Journalists, political analysts, and activists alike seized the moment, unleashing a tidal wave of reactions that would dominate the global conversation for days, weeks, even months. CNN was the first to respond, its lead anchors visibly outraged, denouncing Trump's words as an attack on democracy itself. Headlines appeared. Almost instantly, Trump declares war on the press. President undermines free speech with dangerous rhetoric. The death of journalism. Across major networks, panel discussions erupted with a familiar chorus of condemnation. Pundits and media personalities accused Trump of fostering distrust in the press, painting him as a leader with authoritarian tendencies. The reactions were swift and relentless. Prominent journalists took to television and online platforms to express their outrage. They framed Trump's statement as an existential threat, warning that branding the media as the enemy of the people would embolden attacks on reporters and weaken democratic institutions. Well-known newspaper editorial boards released statements condemning his rhetoric, with some calling for a unified media response against what they saw as an unprecedented assault on press freedom. But Trump, ever the strategist, had anticipated this. He understood the media's playbook, how they would twist his words, how they would amplify the controversy to reinforce their own power. He had seen it happen time and time again, and just as he expected, the more they lashed out, the more people began to question the role of modern journalism itself. As media organizations scrambled to defend themselves, a counter-narrative began to emerge. Political commentators and independent voices, unshackled from corporate newsrooms, argued that Trump was not attacking journalism as a profession, but rather calling out specific networks and journalists who had long abandoned their duty to report the truth objectively. These voices pointed to years of biased reporting, selectively edited interviews, misleading headlines, and the suppression of stories that did not fit a preferred political agenda. For Trump's supporters, this was a moment of reckoning. They had witnessed firsthand how the media treated him differently from previous leaders. They had seen how positive economic numbers were downplayed, how foreign policy victories were ignored, and how every misstep was magnified into a full-blown scandal. To them, Trump's words were not an attack on truth. They were an attack on media manipulation. Social media exploded. Within minutes, Twitter, Facebook, and online forums became battlegrounds for the debate. Hashtags trended worldwide, with one side calling Trump's remarks reckless and the other hailing them as the long-overdue exposure of a corrupt institution. Videos of media hypocrisy circulated rapidly, compiled by independent journalists and content creators who had grown tired of corporate narratives. Clips showed journalists condemning Trump while themselves engaging in misleading reporting. Comparisons were made, highlighting the stark contrast between how the press covered different political figures. Memes, viral tweets, and video compilations fueled an online revolution that challenged the mainstream media's grip on public perception. Even some of Trump's political opponents struggled with how to respond. While many criticized his rhetoric, there were those who quietly acknowledged that his criticism of the press resonated with millions. Some strategists even admitted that media bias had been a problem for years, but had never been challenged so directly by a sitting president. Around the world, foreign leaders and political analysts watched the confrontation unfold, understanding that Trump had done something unprecedented. He had not just challenged an individual journalist or a specific news network. He had taken on the entire media establishment and forced a conversation that many had long avoided. The media's response was aggressive, but it also played into Trump's hands. The more they attacked him, the more they confirmed what he had been saying all along, that they were not neutral arbiters of truth, but active participants in shaping political discourse. As the controversy raged on, Trump did what few politicians dared to do. He doubled down. Rather than retreating, rather than softening his message, he continued to call out the media's dishonesty, exposing case after case where they had misled the public. His words were now more than just a statement. They had become a movement demanding transparency, accountability, and an end to media-controlled narratives. Love him or hate him, Donald Trump had forced the world to confront a question that could no longer be ignored. Was the media truly serving the people, or had it become the enemy of truth? The media had unleashed its full force against Donald Trump. News anchors, journalists, and political analysts filled the airwaves with condemnation, warning that his rhetoric was dangerous, that his words threatened the very foundation of democracy. Editorial boards across the country published scathing rebukes, and pundits declared this to be one of the darkest moments in modern political history. But outside the echo chambers of elite media circles, a very different story was unfolding. Across America, in small towns, bustling cities, and working-class neighborhoods, millions of people saw something entirely different. They didn't see an attack on democracy. They saw a leader refusing to be controlled. They didn't hear reckless rhetoric. They heard a battle cry against a media machine that had long abandoned objectivity. Almost immediately, Trump's supporters mobilized. Social media platforms became battlegrounds where Americans voiced their frustrations, not just with the press, but with an establishment that had ignored them for far too long. They shared their own experiences of media bias, of stories twisted beyond recognition, of narratives carefully crafted to discredit people like them, the everyday citizens, the forgotten workers, the ones who didn't fit the ideological mold dictated by the press. They had watched for years as journalists, instead of holding power to account, acted as political operatives, deciding which stories mattered, which voices were elevated, and which perspectives were silenced. They had seen how positive economic numbers under Trump's leadership were brushed aside, how major achievements were downplayed or ignored, and how scandals were manufactured out of thin air. To them, Trump's words were not just justified, they were necessary. The silent majority speaks loudly. As the media machine worked tirelessly to discredit him, his supporters only became more emboldened. They turned to alternative news sources, independent journalists, and direct broadcasts from Trump himself. They no longer trusted the institutions that had spent years calling them ignorant, backward, and deplorable. They remembered how, in previous elections, news networks had dictated which candidates were viable and which were not. They recalled how Trump, from the very beginning of his campaign, had been treated as a joke, a spectacle, until he wasn't, until he defied the odds and won. And now they saw the same tactics being used against him yet again. But they also knew something else. He had never bowed to pressure before, and he wasn't about to start now. This moment cemented his reputation as a fighter, as a leader who would not surrender to political correctness or media-driven narratives. Unlike traditional politicians who carefully measured their words to appease journalists and protect their public image, Trump had no such concerns. He spoke directly to the people, unfiltered, without hesitation without the approval of the press. For his base, this was the ultimate proof that he was different. He was not controlled, not manipulated, not afraid. A political movement, not just a presidency. The rallying cry spread beyond just the United States. Across the world, people took notice. Trump had done something that no modern leader had dared to do. He had called out the mainstream media on a global stage, refusing to let them define the truth for him or for the people. His supporters saw themselves in him. They had been mocked, ridiculed, and dismissed by the same institutions that now attacked Trump. And when he fought back, they felt like they were fighting back too. Merchandise bearing the phrase "fake news" skyrocketed in popularity. Supporters packed arenas chanting "CNN sucks" whenever Trump mentioned the media's bias. Conservative commentators, long marginalized by mainstream outlets, found newfound energy, rallying behind the president as the only leader, bold enough to challenge the media empire that had gone unchecked for decades. His defenders didn't just praise his words, they took action. They boycotted publications, they created their own media platforms, they exposed instances where news coverage was deliberately misleading. They refused to let the press dictate the truth anymore. Every great leader leaves a legacy. Be part of the conversation. Smash that like button. Share your opinion in the comments and make sure to subscribe for more powerful Trump insights. Unshaken, unstoppable. As the backlash continued, many politicians would have backed down, softened their rhetoric, issued carefully worded clarifications, but Trump did none of that. Instead, he doubled down. He stood firm in his convictions, knowing that what he had said was what millions of people had long believed but had been too afraid to say. And that is why they followed him. That is why they defended him. That is why they stood by him when others crumbled under the weight of media pressure. Because Donald Trump was not just a politician, he was a movement. And in that moment, as the media launched its most aggressive assault against him, he only became stronger. Donald Trump had not simply clashed with a reporter that day. He had drawn a battle line that would redefine the relationship between the press and political power for years to come. His words had not been a fleeting moment of frustration. They had been a declaration of war against an establishment that had long considered itself untouchable. The phrase "enemy of the people" had become more than just a pointed remark. It became a rallying cry, a symbol of the growing distrust between citizens and the media institutions that once claimed to serve them. It became a dividing line between those who believed in the press as a pillar of democracy and those who saw it as an unelected entity wielding unchecked influence over public opinion. The press faces an unprecedented challenge. For decades, the mainstream media had operated with a certain level of dominance. They decided which stories were told, which narratives were pushed, and which individuals were elevated or destroyed in the public sphere. They had shaped elections, policies, and global perceptions, but Trump had shattered the illusion that their power was absolute. By openly challenging them, he forced a national and global reckoning, one that exposed the weaknesses, biases, and manipulations that had long gone. Unchallenged, no longer could they operate without scrutiny. Every misleading headline, every selectively edited clip, every narrative twist was now met with skepticism, not just from Trump's supporters, but from an increasingly aware public that had started questioning everything they were being told. Journalists, once accustomed to speaking with unquestioned authority, found themselves under the microscope. They had positioned themselves as neutral observers, as defenders of truth. But now, many were seen as political actors, participants in the very battles they claimed to merely report on. The rise of alternative media. In the wake of this seismic shift, a new wave of independent journalism and alternative media emerged. Trump's battle with the press had accelerated the decline of trust in traditional news outlets, pushing millions toward alternative platforms that promised transparency, authenticity, and freedom from corporate or political influence. Podcast hosts, citizen, journalists, and independent commentators surged in popularity. They broke stories that mainstream networks ignored, analyzed events from perspectives that had long been suppressed, and provided platforms for voices that had been marginalized. Social media, once a tool primarily used by mainstream networks to push their stories, became the new battleground. Millions bypassed legacy media entirely, getting their news directly from raw sources, live streams, and first-hand accounts. Trump himself, even after leaving office, remained a dominant voice, not through traditional interviews, but through direct communication with the people. A political shift that redefined leadership. Trump's defiance in the face of media pressure set a precedent for future leaders. No longer was it a requirement for politicians to appease the press, to play by the old rules of carefully curated messaging and elite gatekeeping. Future candidates took note of his strategy, understanding that they no longer needed the media to reach the people. They could build movements without the traditional filters that had once dictated political success. The era of press-controlled politics was crumbling. Even those who opposed Trump could not ignore the profound shift he had created. Politicians on all sides began to reconsider how they engaged with the media. Some doubled down on the old ways, while others adapted, embracing the new direct-to-voter model Trump had pioneered. The phrase that echoes through time. Years later, long after that moment in the press room, the phrase "enemy of the people" remained in political discourse. To some, it was a dangerous attack on democracy. To others, it was a long-overdue reckoning with a media machine that had wielded influence without accountability. Regardless of where one stood, no one could deny its power. It became a permanent fixture in the conversation about media bias, journalistic responsibility, and the balance of power between politicians and the press. It forced difficult but necessary debates about whether the media had stayed true to its original mission or whether it had become an instrument of political warfare. The Trump legacy on media and politics. Trump had not merely fought with the press. He had rewritten the rules. He had exposed a reality that many suspected but had been too afraid to confront. The impact of that single moment reverberated far beyond his presidency. It changed how people consumed news, how politicians engaged with the media, and how future leaders would govern in an era where trust in institutions had been forever shaken. And through it all, one thing remained clear. Donald Trump had forever altered the landscape of media and politics. A legacy that cannot be ignored. Donald Trump did not merely challenge the media. He shattered a status quo that had existed for decades. He forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths, to question narratives that had long been taken for granted, and to recognize the immense power that the press held over political discourse. Whether one saw him as a fearless truth-teller or a disruptor of tradition, one fact remained undeniable: he had changed the game forever. The old rules of politics, where leaders tiptoed around media scrutiny, no longer applied. The age of unquestioned journalism was over, and in its place emerged a new era of skepticism, accountability, and a demand for authenticity. Years from now, history will look back on this moment as a turning point, a defining battle between a leader who refused to be controlled and a media establishment that had long dictated public perception. And regardless of where one stood, one truth was inescapable. Donald Trump did not just fight the media. He changed the way the world sees it forever. Strength, strategy, and vision. If these qualities inspire you, you're in the right place. Show your support by liking this video, commenting your thoughts, and subscribing for more.